Good evening. This video is about the United States foreign policy, particularly with regard to China. And I will try to tackle that issue from 3 points. The first is why this particular moment in history is crucially important for American positioning in the world in general and specifically with regard to the dealings, the interaction with China. The second point I will try to address in this video is rather not that American foreign policy is all about geostrategy and international relations, but rather that the insides of America, very important trends in American politics, in American society, do affect massively American positioning in the world and particularly in the relationship with China. And the third point is what is the link between the importance of the moment now and what's happening in America, as in very important trends in the country, together. How is the link? How is the inside affecting the outside, American positioning in this moment in history? Let me start by the first one, which is the importance of the current moment. America has been, in my view, an empire since the beginning of the 20th century. Now, you'll find many Americans who will contest this point, and you'll find many Americans who actually argue that the founding of America in the late 1700s, so the late 18th century, was basically on values that were against, contrary to, the idea of empire. In my view, America has been an empire since the end of the 19th century, or at the very latest, the beginning of the 20th century. Why that time? To bring a very long story to short, at the end of the Civil War in America, so the second half of the 19th century, and then there was this huge reconstruction effort in the South that lost the Civil War, and then at the same time the massive expansion west. So the American state is moving all the way to the west, and then the rush to the gold of California and the building of the west, the reconstruction of the South, and the rush to the west together generated immense wealth in the US at a time when the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, all of that was very much starting to lose a lot of its relative strength compared to America. Relative is important because you can argue Britain was expanding. You can argue France was expanding. Yes, actually. But relative to the wealth that was being generated in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was nothing compared to the United States. And then came the First World War, 1914, 1918, which devastated Europe in many, many, many ways, of course, spurred the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, change of immense social and political changes in Germany, even very important changes in France and Britain. Long story short, from the beginning of the 20th century, America was an empire. And many people think that America at the time was internally focused, so America was not going out to the world. Not true. America actually did go out to the world, established presence in the Pacific. The Philippines, for example, is a good example, and there were other presences. There were primarily clashes between the United States at that time and the Spanish monarchy at the time. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, from the beginning of the 20th century and until today, America has been an empire. But The last 25 years were very particular time for the American empire. Why? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, America was an empire but selectively engaging in the world, leaving more or less large parts of Europe, the Middle East, large parts of Asia, to the old powers, to Britain, to France, and others. And then came the Second World War. Of course, America, after the Second World War, appeared as the most important, extremely powerful and rich empire. But very, very quickly after the Second World War, so from the late 1940s, you had the power of the Soviet Union, checking the United States' presence in the world. You had the Cold War between the United States and the Western camp, on the other side the Soviet Union and the Soviet camp. So there were always, early 20th century, up to the Second World War, during the Second World War, after the Second World War, America was an empire, but there were always other empires there. Either they were declining or they were fighting Second World War, or the Soviet Union, where it was in a confrontation with it, strategic confrontation with it. But from the early 1990s until now, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the communist project in the world, America won. And the key point for that, in those 25 years, America was the only empire in the world. Some people say that is an unprecedented situation in history. And I'm sympathetic, actually, to that, though it's contestable. But what is not contestable is that it is a very unique situation in the last 3 or 4 centuries. That's an important point, because for 25 years or more, almost 30 years, from the beginning of the 1990s until today, 2019, 2020 now, to have one state as the only sole empire in the world, effectively with colossal influence over almost every part of the world, that's a dramatic, strategic positioning. But that positioning is now changing. It's very clear that China is not just a rising power. China is a real challenging empire. Now, that means that you have a moment in history in which 25 years of uninterrupted supremacy of the United States across effectively the whole world, and a mindset in which it has seen itself as the only empire in the world, with at least one, some would say 2 generations of decision makers from the early 1990s, mid-1990s until today, who have looked at the world, shaped American foreign policy with the mindset that America is the sole power in the world, sole superpower in the world. Now that mindset is now seeing a country very powerful, huge, colossal demographics, very substantial economic power, and behind it, major economy, major consumption power and production power, huge influence on many industries in the world, especially manufacturing industries in the world. All of that is rising to challenge it, not just as a potential empire, but certainly as a coming empire. To conclude this point, the moment in time is very important, not just strategically because the two countries are potentially going to face off each other. It's very important because from an American point of view, the mindset is facing a very interesting moment, that it is not only going to potentially look at China and see what it will do about it, but rather the American mindset itself in its strategic outlook is facing effectively a shock, something that you got used to for now 25 years, and now you are realizing that it is not sustainable, that it is facing a major challenge, psychologically even, whether for individuals or for a nation, certainly for decision-making circles, it is very interesting timing. So this is point one, about why the time is very important. The second point that I wanted to highlight is what's happening in America now. And I do not mean here protests there and major racial issues here. That's all very important. But what is, in my opinion, at the heart of that, beneath the surface, is or are very major key change in American society. To summarize, in the past 50 years, America went through a number of very important changes. In the 60s, you had the civil rights movement, which basically empowered Black Americans or African Americans, and that was also a shock to some segments in the American society. In the 70s, there was a second trend, and that is the rise of political Christianity in America. Now, America has always been a very pious country compared to all other Western countries. The role of religion and Christianity in particular in America has been super powerful for decades. Though actually it is quite interesting that for the most influential founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, for example, and others, their views, their conception of the divine, of God, was far from that you find in monotheistic religions. It's far from the classic interpretations of scriptures. But anyway, that's the second point. But I'm trying to say that in the 70s, there was another important development, which is the huge empowerment of political Christianity in American politics. And that antagonized, on the other side, many of the liberal, secular Americans, particularly on the coasts, on the East Coast, New York, Boston, or the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego. So the urban elite, those were very antagonized by that. And then you had in the 80s a huge increase in immigration, particularly Hispanic immigration, which also antagonized many conservatives. But because America at the time was still embroiled in the Cold War, the American society was very much cohesive, you can argue. Certainly, American domestic politics was centered on the idea that America is fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, you started to see these divisions in America coming to the surface. That's why in the 90s, particularly in the time of the two terms of Bill Clinton, you started to see real change in the rhetoric of politics in America. Serious polarization between the Democrats and the Republicans, and continued. Some people say after September 11th, 2001, also there was a moment of cohesion in America. But that lasted a number of years. Anybody who followed American politics in the last 10 years or so noticed, certainly, the massive polarization in American politics between Democrats and Republicans. But what I'm trying to say is that in the last 10 years, it's not just change in rhetoric, not just polarization between the two political parties, but the tone, the nature of politics in America changed in the way that it's no longer the two sides, the two social camps behind this and behind that, are no longer looking at each other as, well, the other has wrong policies, or the other has a mistaken argument, or the other has a view that I disagree with and it is wrong. No. In the past 10, 15 years, what we have in America are the two camps presenting the other as often morally wrong, often un-American, often with a way of life, with a way of seeing American society, with a way of seeing American values that are completely opposing to the other. So it's not just, well, I disagree with what you say, your argument is wrong. No, it's by far more pugnacious than that, by far more confrontational than that. The point I'm trying to arrive at is that it's not just that the rhetoric of American politics have changed in the last 10 or 15 years. Rather, it is that we are starting to see the political process in America becoming very polarized, that it is posing huge challenges to decision-making in America, decision-making in internal political issues at the Congress or at the executive, certainly the interaction between the executive, the White House, and Congress. It even, in my opinion, has further problems, further challenges. Why? Because America has always had a very rich central ground, you can say public space. American universities, for example, the big Ivy League universities, the major American newspapers, the major TV networks in America, even literature. America had always had this idea of the grand American novel, or play, the thinking of people such as Hemingway or Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller or Philip Roth even recently, those people who supposedly fired the American imagination and tried to come up with this idea of the essence of American society in a piece of art. Even that has been diminished a lot over the past 10, 20 years. Why? Because the two different social camps in America are coming from very different points of view, not just on public policies, but on how they see America, how they see its values, the nature of its project, how they see the American way of living. The views are becoming not just different, but much more now very polarized, opposing each other, and often pugnacious in how they deal with each other. The impact of that is, and that's the third point, the link between the internal, what's happening in America, and the external, its foreign policy, is that increasingly there are very different views inside America on what is the role of America in the world. There are very different views today, opposing views on what are the major strategic interests of America in the world, and on how can America defend those interests in the world. To conclude, the timing, the historical moment is very important. The key trends, major important changes in America are very serious, with potentially major social consequences on America, but those social changes are affecting the decision-making process of the executive, the interaction between the executive, the White House, and the Congress, how America views its role in the world, divisions on what that is, how America views its interests in the world, divisions on what those are, how America views how it is to defend those interests, divisions on that, and all of these divisions, changes, you can say weakening of decision-making process, are happening at a very important point in which the American empire is waking up to the moment of change in which there is another empire rising and potentially going to be not necessarily confronting it head on, but certainly the interests are not aligned. So anyone looking at the foreign policy of America, the positioning of America in this moment in time, in my view, needs to appreciate two things. One, that the historical moment now is incredibly important. So it's not that the next few weeks or months, but the next few years are very important for the interaction between the old empire that has ruled supreme alone for 25 years and the rising empire. And two, that major trends in American politics in the last 40 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, are affecting the dynamics of decision-making in America and even the dynamics of seeing America's role in the world, which very much will affect how America conducts its foreign policy in different parts of the world, particularly the challenge of meeting the rising new empire.